All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this FPRI special briefing. The German voters have spoken. What did they say? Which is an effort to make some sense out of the German elections that took place on Saturday, or Sunday, I should say, Sunday, September 26th, so just a couple of days ago. We are having this live event on Wednesday, the 29th. So we've had a couple of days to digest a little bit of the information, but there is still a lot that we don't know. So the purpose of this discussion is to help people get a little caught up by answering some questions that they may have, and in part by summarizing an article that I wrote for FPRI on the subject that was published on Monday, the 27th. Who am I, you ask? My name is Ron Granieri. I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. I am also a Templeton Education Fellow at FPRI, and I am a Associate Professor of History in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College, which compels me to add that the opinions that I will express in this program are all simply my own, and they do not reflect necessarily the opinions of the U.S. Army War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. All that being said, I am a German historian by training and an observer of German politics, and I wrote a longish piece for FPRI that was published on Monday, the 27th, about the election. I'm going to summarize that a little bit in this discussion. I will present some information to you, but also I want to be able to answer your questions. So please, submit any questions that come to mind using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I will be delighted to interact with them with you. I'm sorry we can't do this completely live, but this is the best we can do. So the Germans voted on the 26th of September, and this was a momentous vote because it was for the first time in 16 years that the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, was not on the ballot. Merkel, who'd spent 16 years as chairman of her CDU party, the Christian Democratic Union, and as chancellor, she had decided that 4 terms was enough. Which is just about the longest period of time that anyone has been Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, what had been West Germany, founded in 1949. She comes just a little bit short of the full record held by her predecessor in the CDU, and that is Helmut Kohl, who also served a little over 16 years in office. But she decided that she didn't want to run again, even though her popularity was still quite high. And so this was an interesting moment for the German people to decide to enter into a new era, to decide what that new era might look like. Merkel was herself the head of a government coalition of the 2 biggest political parties, what the Germans call a grand coalition. In other words, the 2 largest parties that often disagree with each other, but that they came together to form a large centrist bloc. And that those 2 parties are Merkel's CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, along with their Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, or CSU. They have a unique relationship. I'm a scholar and part of the CDU-CSU, and I'm happy to answer questions about that. They are roughly in agreement on most policies, but the CSU exists only within the state of Bavaria. The CDU exists every place else in Germany. And so after national elections, the 2 parties, they are formally distinct, but they come together to form a single party group. So that's one side. They're roughly on the center right. They are a Christian Democratic political party. Their coalition partner going into this election was the Social Democratic Party, the SPD, which would be the center left party. This is the modern offshoot of socialist parties going back to the 19th century. The CDU, CSU, and the SPD had been in this grand coalition in part because of the fragmentation of German politics, and it wasn't clear that there were other majorities possible, right? Germany is a parliamentary system. The chancellor needs to have a majority in the Bundestag, the parliament, and that majority was supplied by these 2 big parties. So in this election, right, one of the big questions is what often happens when there is this kind of grand coalition is what kinds of other political movements or parties will emerge that will challenge what appears to be a kind of cartel of the 2 major parties. And the results of the election, and I'm going to share you an image of the results of the election so that you can see. This is from the official federal election office in Germany. So I'm going to do that again because I don't think that I stop the share. I'm going to try sharing that one more time so I can share it appropriately. and I hope that you can see that to give you an idea of the results of the election, that the CDU-CSU, Chancellor Merkel's Chancellor Merkel's party group, they were big losers in this election. They lost more than 8 percentage points. Before the election, they'd been in the previous election, they'd won almost a third of the overall vote, 32+%. This time they won about 24% of the vote. The SPD, the Social Democrats, they did better. They got almost 26% of the vote. So they came in first, if you will. But then we see a variety of smaller parties that reached double digits, and they include both the Alternative for Germany, the AFD, that's the light blue on your on the chart there. The yellow, the AFD, we'll talk about them. They are your right populists. The FDP, which is a liberal party in the European sense, the Free Democratic Party, they are generally pro-business, pro-urban professional party. The Die Linke, or the Left Party, which is a party that's made up of an agglomeration of the former Communist Party, the former Socialist Party that ran East Germany, plus some disaffected Social Democrats. The Greens are an environmental party, which has tried to position themselves more as a party of the, let's say, the educated but pro-environmental bourgeoisie. The Greens there, they've got almost 15% of the vote. And then we have the CSU, which is counted separately than the CDU, even though they come together. And that's what we have. So the result is the existing government of the CDU-CSU and the SPD. They did maintain their majority. They could continue in office, but both parties had made pretty clear that they don't intend to come together again. So that means there's going to have to be a new government. And at the moment, at least, because the SPD, led by Olaf Scholz, because the SPD came in first, they are likely to be the first party that will attempt to put together a majority coalition. And we can talk about what that means politically and the individuals involved in your questions. But the CDU-CSU disappointed by falling behind. The leader of the leading candidate of the CDU-CSU is a man named Armin Laschet, who was the governor of one of Germany's largest states, North Rhine-Westphalia. He had promised to carry on Merkel's legacy, but he had stumbled. He was not a very good campaigner. And so the CDU-CSU's result has been very disappointing. The SPD under Scholz, even though the party itself, the SPD, much like we think about the Democrats in the United States or other center-left parties, right? There's a very strong progressive wing. Scholz actually came from the more moderate, pragmatic wing of the party, in part because the SPD wanted to get somebody who could grab the middle of the political spectrum. And he is currently the finance minister in Merkel's government, but now he's making a bid to be chancellor. Of the other parties, those smaller parties, the two that are most important for forming a future government are the FDP, the Free Democrats in yellow, and the Greens in green. Both of them profited from the sort of the loss of centrist votes from the CDU-CSU and even from the SPD. There was a time early in most of the history of the Federal Republic of Germany when between them, the CDU-CSU and the SPD could count on getting 80+% of the total vote. Indeed, there are some elections where those two parties would get 90% of the vote, and it was that Germany was functionally a two-party state with just usually the small FDP changing coalition partners to decide who got a majority. Things have changed. We now have a political system where even those two bigger parties now, as we see, are roughly getting a quarter of the vote each. That means that half of the vote is going to other political parties. This is a big change on the German landscape that's been coming in several elections. And now we're going to see how that works, because it is very likely that whatever government is formed now after this election will probably be made up of three political parties. Since it's unlikely that the CDU-CSU and the SPD will create a coalition, it's going to be either of those larger parties with the Greens and with the FDP to get to that majority. And that will make for some interesting politics, right? Three-party coalitions are not unusual elsewhere in Europe. They're not unusual in other parliamentary systems. They are unusual for the Germans. And so one of the big questions, we already had this question of, what is the German political environment going to be like after Angela Merkel? But now that question is even more profound because now there's going to be whoever replaces her is not only not going to have immediately her sort of global stature, but that person is also going to be having to wrestle a more complicated coalition than she ever had to deal with. And so what that will mean for the future of Germany is an open question. One could argue that the people, they voted for, I'll say this, that generally speaking, political scientists who study the German political system going back through the history of West Germany from 1949 until reunification in 1990 and since 1990, is German politics tend to be more consensus based in the sense that it's usually about because it involves coalitions, because it involves these parties that are sort of fighting over the center, that we are going to sort of see what it's like for an electorate that wanted change, that represented change, but at the same time chose the most, let's say, the most consensus-minded and conservative form of change they could, right? They didn't give anybody a landslide. They did vote for the SPD by a small margin more than the CDU, but the person who led the SPD is actually a current member of the current government as finance minister. So it's change, but not really change. And so that's why the role of these smaller parties, the role of the FDP and the Greens, who have not been in government for quite some time, that they now have a chance to see if they can put a little sort of fresh oomph into German politics, some fresh oomph into the government. Though that's a technical term, oomph. But the real challenge is going to be to see how well they can do that, how well they can work with each other. Because while the Greens and the FDP both profited greatly from the votes of younger voters and new voters and voters who specifically said they wanted to see some more reforms, the basic political positions of the FDP and the Greens when it comes to political reform are not only not identical, they are often very much at odds with each other, right? The Greens have their origins in the environmental movements of the 1970s. Indeed, when they first entered the West German Bundestag in 1983, they were a party very much of the environmental and pacifist left. They were anti-NATO. They were very much in favor of abolishing nuclear power and positions that were considered at the time to be on the sort of left fringe of the spectrum. They have moved very much to the center. They are actually now much more advocates of NATO and the Atlantic Alliance insofar as they're strong defenders of Western values in the face of Russian aggression in Europe and in the face of Chinese human rights violations. And also some of their environmental positions, which once upon a time appeared to be extreme, have been adopted by many of the other political parties. It was, after all, Merkel's government in 2011 that announced that Germany was indeed going to close all of its nuclear power plants. So the Greens have moved towards the center, but they are still very much a party that, when it comes to domestic politics, that they are in favor of spending more on infrastructure. They are in favor of let's say their version of the Green New Deal, right? In a sense, they are OG Green New Dealers. And so that puts them, on the center left of the political spectrum. Whereas the FDP, for its part, while they have often styled themselves to be more liberal in the sense that they are more libertarian than the Christian Democrats, the FDP has traditionally been more pro-business. Under their leadership of their young party chairman, Christian Lindner, they've been advocates for tax cuts, for austerity. They argue for digital reformation and things that are supposed to make Germany more modern, but their version of modernity generally does not involve spending a lot of money on environmental projects. And the example that's often given here is the role of the German auto industry. Whereas the Greens, of course, they speculate openly about environmental changes that might outlaw internal combustion engines. The FDP, with its close ties to business, is generally skeptical about big, fast changes. And so while both the FDP and the Greens went into this campaign saying they wanted to be part of any future government, and while most observers talking about their role in any future government assumed they would end up together in a coalition, there is we're still not sure exactly how that's going to work. And that's going to be, of course, the challenge for whichever of those two bigger political parties is the leader in this coalition, is going to have to, it's going to need those votes of the Greens and the FDP, and is going to have to figure out how to manage the disagreements between those two parties. But that's as a purely numbers game. On your right here, we see the image, the half pie chart is based on the votes on your left. The right, this is these are the seats in the upcoming German parliament. And it's quite a multicolored bunch here, right? Because there are going to be 735 seats in the Bundestag. And of those seats, the CDU and CSU together will have about 196 seats. The SPD will have about 206. The AfD will have 83. The FDP will have 92. The left, Die Linke, will have 39. The Greens will have 118. And the South Schleswig voter organization, which is a special party that has a special responsibility to represent the Danish minority up way north in northern Germany, they will send one lonely deputy to parliament. But you can see what the way that those numbers work, right? 735 seats. In order to elect a chancellor, you need to get half of those votes. So you can do the math in your head, right? That is so roughly 367, 368. Right? All right. Anybody wants to check me, they can comment in the comments. To figure out how you get to that number will take a little bit of work. And so that's how we imagine the purely numbers game. There are other issues. We talk about the ideologies of the political parties, but I also want to show you a slightly different map to give you another image to work with, and that is this one. And this is a picture of the map of Germany. This is the German electoral system is complicated. Even a lot of Germans don't completely understand it. And I'm not going to overwhelm you with it, but I'll say that the way that they decide how many seats are in parliament is there are 299 electoral districts in Germany. And every one of those districts, in every one of those districts, a person is elected deputy is elected to the Bundestag. So that's essentially, roughly half of the seats are set aside that way. When Germans vote, they cast two votes. They cast a vote in their district for the candidate they want to have the direct seat, and they also cast a vote for a political party. And then after the votes are counted, right, it's first decided who wins the districts, but then the second votes are counted to figure out the breakdown proportionally of how many. That's how when we talk about 26% for the SPD, 24 for the CDU, CSU, 14, 15 for the Greens. That once they have the percentage numbers, they then compare the way the seats break down for the direct elections, and then they figure out how many other seats have to be added to make sure that you have the proportional representation. As I say, it's a little complicated. I am unaware of any other parliamentary system that quite does this, right? Most parliamentary systems, you think in Canada or in Great Britain, you have purely district situations where you vote in your district, and then after the election is over, you see who won which districts, and that's how you figure out who has a majority in parliament. In a place like, say, Israel, people just go and they vote for the party, and then they count up the number. So Germany has both direct representation through districts and proportional representation mashed together. This map is to give you an idea of which party won in each of these districts. And it gives you an idea that the colors here reflect the traditional, more or less the traditional coloring of that's associated with German political parties. So the black, that's the CDU. And you see the CDU is strong in the Southwest. They are strong in Western Germany, especially in the heavily Catholic areas along the Rhineland, a little bit in conservative areas in the North, and scattered through the East. The dark blue, which also could be black in the bottom there, that's the CSU in Bavaria. As you see, the CSU won all but one of the districts within Bavaria, except for that one little bitty district in Munich that went to the Greens. The Greens have their strength in various university cities. In fact, you could pick out virtually all the major German universities by looking at the green. You have Freiburg down here, you've got Munich over here, you've got Heidelberg over here, you've got Tübingen over here. It's an interesting, I think you've got the cities along the Rhine as well. The red is the Social Democrats. As you see, they're very strong in the industrial areas in much of Western Germany and across the northern parts of the former East Germany. And then the light blue, that's the Alternative for Germany, right? That is the right-wing populist party, which has settled into some serious local strength in the states of, this is Saxony, Thuringia, and a little bit of Saxony-Anhalt. And indeed, in Saxony and Thuringia, these two states here, which would have been the southernmost states of the old East Germany, the AfD actually came out number one, the party that won the most votes in those states, which is a very interesting thing. You'll notice there are no other light blue folks outside of the former East Germany, right? So that shows where the AfD is strongest. And there are a couple of seats left. The purple that you can barely see here are on Leipzig, and up here in Berlin. Those are seats that went to the left party, Die Linke. We see Germany it has a tradition of regional divisions. It has and those regional divisions reflect themselves still in politics, right? Relatively more conservative and Catholic South and West, relatively more secular and labor-oriented North and East, and now growing, especially in the southern part of the former GDR, sort of a strong sort of protest vibe against the existing political parties. So that's the results of the election. We are waiting to see what will happen now that we have the numbers, now that we know the seats, now that we know that there's going to be 735 seats, and we know who is sitting in which, we know who's going to be sitting in parliament. Now coalition negotiations begin. And so now it remains to be seen. We know that representatives of the Greens and the FDP have already met to talk about the possibility of how they're going to work together, that the strategy that they are suggesting is that they want to work out their differences so that then they can present a united front in dealing with either the SPD or the CDU-CSU. We'll see how well that goes. The CDU-CSU is struggling now that Armin Laschet, who had been their chancellor candidate because he had done so badly, he is formally the chair of the CDU as a political party. There is a big question about whether he should remain as chair after presiding over such a disastrous election result. In the past, party chairmen who lose a quarter of their party's overall votes usually don't hold on to their jobs. But as of right now, as I look at my watch, right at a little after 20 after 1 in the afternoon Eastern time on Wednesday, 29 September, he still has his job, but nobody's completely sure. Laschet has resisted calls to formally congratulate Olaf Scholz of the SPD for winning the election, because he says that we're so close that both of us have the right to try to form a government. Other leaders in the CDU-CSU bloc have been a little more generous to the Social Democrats, right? The chair of the CSU, Markus Söder, actually did issue a statement where he congratulated the SPD on their election victory. Chancellor Merkel herself congratulated the SPD on their election result, but she didn't call it a victory, which was so she's trying to smooth over the waters within the CDU. But the question of what kind of government is going to be formed, what parties will it include, this is going to take a while. Because when you have something, the Germans, usually the political parties, when they come up with governments, they will actually write up a detailed coalition agreement, which will identify the main sort of policy questions. They'll say, these are our priorities, our common priorities. These are the things we're going to try to do. And it'll take a while to hammer that out. After the election in 2017, the negotiations to create a government lasted 5 months. So we don't know if it'll take that long, but it can take quite some time. In the meantime, Chancellor Merkel, for better or worse, right, her retirement is delayed. She stays on as caretaker chancellor, so running the government from now until a new government is sworn in, which, unlike in the United States, where we have a formal period between election day and inauguration day, the Germans, the parliament will open, the new parliament will gather relatively quickly and will begin to try to take up its business, but it won't actually vote on a chancellor until a coalition is ready to vote on that. And so they can do that sort of as quickly as they can get to it. But we assume it's probably going to take them a number of weeks or a number of months. So that's a quick tour d'horizon of the election results, of the numbers of the parties. I want to pause there for a second to see if there are any questions so far before we talk about what kind of political challenges or changes we can expect to see. I'm going to take a look at my question and answer sheet here. I don't see any questions in the Q&A right now, but I hope that somebody will, you will feel free to, here comes one. Why not a grand coalition? All right. Gregory Bloomquist asked this question. This is an excellent question. Why not a grand coalition? I mean, partially it's because the SPD in particular feels as though being in grand coalitions with Merkel's government has not done very good for them. That, that the SPD and CDU have been in a grand coalition for 12 of the past 16 years. And for most of that time, the SPD has seen their share of the national vote decline, because being the junior partner, especially because Merkel was so aggressive in her centrism, that that any successes of the government were her successes, and any failures of the government, were the parties had to suffer. And so there's a sense that this SPD feels as though they want to be liberated from having to being forced to be centrist. And even within the CDU-CSU, there's a sense that while Merkel was really good at maintaining the coalition, and while the CDU-CSU itself is a pretty diverse party, and so being centrist is sort of in their DNA, and that they prefer to govern, there's also a sense there that being forced to be in the center, that Merkel that they'd lost voters especially on their more conservative flank, and that's what led to the rise of the AfD. So for both of the two big political parties, they both kind of hope that separating themselves from the grand coalition and allowing them to develop their unique identity to become more clear to the voters, that this will serve them in the future. Because it's worth noting that before 2005, which was when Merkel was first elected in a very close election and formed a grand coalition, before 2005, the Federal Republic of Germany had only had a grand coalition for 3 years in the mid to late 60s, and that was very much considered a stopgap measure, because there were certain constitutional questions that had to be resolved. Because the problem with the grand coalition is, if you have, especially in a political system that the Germans had enjoyed for so long, where you had two very big political parties, that if you have a grand coalition, there is no clear opposition. And this can lead to a sort of frustration. The public looks at government and they see that the two main political parties are essentially governing together. It's like a power cartel. And so there are other places where grand coalitions are more common. In Austria, for example, grand coalitions have gone on for a long time. But for Germany, for a long time, grand coalitions were kind of unusual. And Merkel's success in managing a grand coalition has also reflected the problems in German politics, that because the political parties, the smaller political parties, if you will, were so dug in their positions, that there weren't that many possibilities for coalitions. And now that there are more possibilities, there's a sense that it would be healthier for German democracy if you had a government with a stable majority, but also a good-sized party in opposition. One of the challenges after 2017 is with the grand coalition of the SPD and the CDU-CSU, is the next largest party in the parliament was the Alternative for Germany, which essentially made them officially the leading opposition party, which made a lot of people nervous. So not likely. It's not impossible for there to be a grand coalition, but it's unlikely. So that's that. Thomas Trop says, what was the significance of the term Christian in the party title of the Christian Democratic Union? Well, the CDU was formed after World War II, and across much of continental Europe, traditional conservatism had been, let's say, discredited by its association with nationalism and by the compromises that conservative parties had made with Nazism and fascism. And so you had the beginning of this movement, or the growth of this movement called Christian democracy, where you had political parties that tried to establish a sort of center-right political identity that was built not on nationalism and not on class conflict, but that was built on notions of community responsibility, and sort of social conservatism, but also very much a connection to the West, anti-communism. You had Christian democratic parties in Italy, in the Low Countries, and in Germany, and in France. In Portugal, you had them through much of continental Europe, especially in the Catholic sections of Europe, and we still have them in various places. And the CDU and the CSU have been among the leaders in this sort of transnational cooperation of Christian democratic political parties, even though social and political changes have been such that the specifically Christian content of the parties is is not the same as it was in the late 1940s. In fact, the deputy leader of the CDU in Cologne, Cologne being a very Catholic city, was the home city of Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chairman of the CDU and the first chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. The deputy chair of the CDU in Cologne, who was recently elected to the Bundestag, is a woman who is the daughter of Turkish guest workers, Serap Güler. And so, but the tradition of Christian democracy as a kind of center-right politics that emphasizes community, so therefore was responsible for helping to create the German welfare state, but also was very much a strong advocate of Western cooperation against the Soviets, and also a very strong advocate for European cooperation, right? That tradition is still part of what animates the basic ideas of the CDU. We can come back to that. Martha Norton asked, what does the fact that the government will need to be a three-party government reflect a growing weakness in political parties in Germany? That's a good question, right? That in some ways, right, people had been nervous, right? If you have that for between the early 1950s and the 1980s, you really only had three parties in the Bundestag, right? The CDU-CSU, if we count that as one party, which actually is sort of two parties, but one party, the SPD and the FDP. And so governments were usually Christian Democrats with the Liberals or Social Democrats with the Liberals. Then come the Greens in 1983. So and then you have four parties, but you still were able to make pretty stable coalitions. But then after reunification, when you have the emergence of the party that eventually becomes the Die Linke, the left party, right? Now you have five parties. And then when you have the AfD, you now have six. And people are a little nervous about this for good reason, because they remember the Weimar experience of, if you have too many political parties, does this mean you have too much fragmentation? Now, German electoral law is such to try to protect against fragmentation, right? Is that you can only get representation in the Bundestag if your party gets at least 5% of the vote nationally, or wins at least 3 direct elected districts. So basically, if you get 3 elected, if you get 5%, right, then you're assigned 5% of the seats. If you get less than 5%, but you win those 3 direct seats, you'll get the total number of seats that go with your percentage. So that's why the Die Linke, for example, in this election actually got less than 5% of the total vote, but they won 3 districts, and so they will send 39 representatives to the Bundestag. Okay, so there's that. The German system is designed to fight against fragmentation, but a certain amount of fragmentation has come just by the fact that people disagree and that the big parties no longer have complete claim on voter loyalty like they used to. So that can be dangerous. But at the same time, as I point out in my article for FPRI and other people have pointed out, I'm not the only person to think of this, 75% of the vote went to 4 parties, went to the CDU, CSU, the SPD, the Greens, and the FDP. Those are 4 parties who each in their own way are completely supportive of the existing constitutional system. They're not radicals. They don't want to make change. And so, yes, it'll be harder to build a coalition, but in itself, having to build a coalition with 3 parties doesn't necessarily mean a danger to democracy. If anything, it could be that people now can, if people feel more comfortable voting for different parties and they're more comfortable with watching those parties sort of slug it out in democratic within the disagreements of democracy and building a coalition, this could actually create some kind of stability. But that depends a lot on how the parties choose to behave in their negotiations, because the parties still have great institutional advantages, and so it'll be interesting to see how they work out their disagreements in this new system. I see a question here from Walter McDougall about the patterns in German politics going back to Weimar, and it is quite interesting, right? Is that the CDU, CSU, and the SPD, they both have traditions that go back to the origins of modern German democracy. The SPD very directly, right? The Social Democratic Party was born in the 19th century during the German Empire in the 1870s and the 1880s as what had been various socialist movements came together to form a single party. And as that party gradually dropped its revolutionary demands, for socialist Marxist revolution, but instead talked about social reform within a parliamentary system. So the SPD, they go back a long way. The CDU and the CSU are formally, these are parties that are created after World War II, but both of them have their roots in earlier political parties, right? Especially the Catholic Center Party, which represented within the old Imperial Germany, which represented the southern and western parts of Catholic Germany. They were in favor of more democracy because they were protecting the rights of a Catholic minority within a Protestant-dominated empire. And then you also had the Bavarian People's Party in Bavaria, which was had a relationship to the center very much like the CDU and the CSU. They often collaborated, although they didn't go all the way to what the CDU and the CSU do now of working together in parliament. But these are parties that have great ties going back. The Free Democrats also go back to various liberal parties that existed, right? Going back to the German. In Weimar, the DDP, the German Democratic Party. This was actually a party that saw itself as more secular than the center, but not socialist. So therefore, they couldn't be the SPD either. This is the political party of people like Walter Rathenau and even people in the long run, people like Gustav Stresemann, who would eventually become, would help to make the Weimar Republic function for the years that it did function in the 1920s. And the old Weimar coalition, right? When the German Empire loses the First World War and they write the Constitution and they create this new Republican system, the three parties that are the basis of the Weimar coalition are the Center, the SPD, and the DDP. Now, gradually, there will be other parties that will emerge on the right of the DDP, the German People's Party, the German National People's Party, and eventually the Nazis and the communists as well emerge too. But in a sense, right, FDP, CDU, CSU, FDP, SPD, this is the Weimar coalition, right? These are the three streams of generally pro-Republican, the sense of the existence of the Republic, pro-Republican, pro-parliamentarian streams within German politics. And the Greens, who initially emerged as a kind of outlier, have modified their positions so that they also are generally pro the existing governmental system, generally believing in stability, but see themselves as slightly different on a slightly different social basis, let's say, than the SPD, which has its origins in the labor movement, its origins in socialist politics. So that's where the parties all come from, and the issue of what are what do the parties disagree on, right? This is a good question, right? And certainly in domestic politics, right, the CDU, CSU, and the FDP are both generally, as I say, center right. They are in favor of government austerity in some ways. They are pro-business, but they're not exactly the same, right? Is that the CDU, CSU, because of its connections to Catholic social teaching and to the Christian churches, has generally been much more sympathetic to the welfare state, helped to create it. And the CDU, CSU, they both have a left wing, if you will, that generally tends to shock their fellow conservative parties when they meet them, right? That for an American Republican would probably find most of the domestic social positions of the CDU and the CSU to be, disturbingly socialist. But that says a lot more about the narrowness of American political thinking and politics than it does the socialism of the CDU. But it is worth thinking about. Whereas the FDP, because of its secular attachments to individual freedom, generally tends to be both, in a weird way that is true in European politics, is both to the left of the CDU and to the right of the SPD. And they can actually be sort of to the left and the right of the CDU, because they are more free market. They're more in favor of tax cuts. The Free Democrats are less enthusiastic about European integration than the Christian Democrats are, who've made European integration a big part of their identity since they were formed. Whereas the SPD, generally, they're in favor of greater social spending. They have been very much a part of the German establishment when it comes to issues of foreign policy, which we'll talk about in a sec. But they are a party of that has struggled, like a lot of center-left parties have, is what do you do to maintain the welfare state in an era where there's increasing sort of pressure from global international competition to make the welfare state less generous. And the Greens, right, in addition to their environmental positions, right, the Greens generally take positions on domestic politics and domestic spending that are in line with those of the SPD, but reflecting the fact that many Greens started their lives connected to the SPD. Now, when it comes to foreign policy, there's a broad consensus, certainly among these four parties, a broad consensus in favor of continuing German membership in NATO, in favor of continuing German membership in the European Union, even if there might be different smatterings of Euroscepticism or criticism within them. And indeed, what I just was reading articles this morning, right, that people have talked about this, that foreign policy, which did not come up very much in the campaign itself, because there weren't that many strong disagreements among these four parties on foreign policy, that's likely where we're going to see the greatest continuity, which is both from Merkel to the present. And that's both good and bad, right? It's good because continuity is good and it's reliable, but it's bad because Merkel's foreign policy had been kind of in a certain way, kind of blah. In the sense, Merkel saying we're in favor of the transatlantic alliance, we're in favor of NATO membership, but we're not quite spending 2% on our defense, and we're going to get around to that. The CDU is more in favor of doing that than the other parties. We're in favor of Europe, but we also we want to make sure that the profligate Southern Europeans don't spend all of Germany's money. So we're a little skeptical about what's going on there. And so people who were hoping to see Germany take a more active role in sort of reshaping the European Union, or a more active role in reshaping political cooperation within the transatlantic alliance, they may be disappointed because so far, at least, none of these political parties has shown a lot of ambition when it comes to foreign policy. Remains to be seen how that works out. And this is especially a big deal when we talk about economic questions and we talk about questions of dealing with China in particular. Because the role of the business interests, Merkel herself had been an advocate for engagement with China, reflecting the fact that the German auto industry wants to be able to make and sell cars to the Chinese. While even if the CDU-CSU is not in government, right, Olaf Scholz has also been relatively conventional in his belief that the German economy depends on the Chinese market. And the FDP in particular, with its pro-business attitudes, kind of feels that way. The Greens are the only ones of the major political parties who've been much more outspoken in challenging too much cooperation with the Chinese. And that could that could be very interesting, because since the Greens would be the second biggest party in any coalition, usually that party's leader becomes foreign minister. And so a Green foreign minister might be more creative or aggressive in thinking about the way that Germany and Europe should deal with the rest of the world. But that remains to be seen. And I think these are that's is going to be very interesting to see, because we're likely to see a great deal of continuity at first, but whether that actually leads to creative ideas remains to be seen. And so, William Schneider, you asked the question about defense modernization. Is right? The CDU-CSU has very clearly said, right, Germany has made this commitment to hitting the 2% target, and we're still committed to that goal, even though nobody can say exactly when they're going to do it. The SPD and the Greens, right, in their own way, right, the SPD has a wing of the party that is not all that enthusiastic about spending more in defense, right? They want to spend more money on other things. And so they've been more willing to sort of kick the can down the road. The Greens have been very, much to the shock, I'm sure, of anybody who's been a Green since the 1980s, the Greens have become much more, they say many more positive things about the Atlantic Alliance now than they did in the 1980s. But they also, they talk a lot about, we prefer diplomacy to military. There's ambivalence about military engagements, especially outside of Europe. And so it's a little unclear what's going to happen. And there's a larger question here about how we should imagine the modernization and the development of NATO. Or development of a European defense identity. And this is where, France out there with Emmanuel Macron, and I encourage you to take a look at the discussion I had with Joe Devec about his book about Emmanuel Macron a couple weeks ago. But Macron talks about how NATO is brain dead and Europe needs strategic autonomy. There are some people in Germany who like that idea, but nobody really knows exactly what it means. And it's a little, and both Laschet and Scholz made a point of visiting with Macron before the election. So they want to say, right, Franco-German cooperation is important. But what that's actually going to mean is anybody's guess right now. And that's so that nobody really knows. And now, if you ask me, Once again, my opinion is my own and not of anybody that I happen to work for. When we think about modernization of NATO, it is worth noting, right? We talk about how little the Europeans spend on defense. But if you add up the defense budgets of the European NATO members, they add up to the second largest defense budget in the world, second only to the United States, bigger than that of the, bigger than the Japanese, bigger than the Chinese, bigger than the Russians. The question is, what do you spend the money on? And so in a sense, trying to get the Europeans, it's less a matter of dollars and cents than it is just thinking about how do we, or euros and cents for that matter. But it is a matter of deciding what you're going to spend the money on. Is there any kind of guiding strategic principle? Are you investing in the right technologies? Are you, or are you just all spending the same things over and over again? And those are questions that the Europeans are going to have to think about strategically, whoever the next government of Germany is going to be. But it's also connected to the question of European integration, because the math just doesn't add up, right? No single European state, no matter how rich it is, can hope to compete on defense matters on its own, faced with large continental powers like the United States and China. It's silly to think about that. What Europeans should be thinking about is creating a common defense identity. But once again, that's where we get into issues of European integration, which in the post-Brexit era are kind of difficult. But I would say watch this space, because that question of NATO going forward is, Merkel was able, by virtue of the fact that she had good sort of street cred within the Atlantic Alliance, right? She was able to sort of manage expectations. A new German government might have to be more direct in dealing with these kinds of questions. All right, Barbara Bisno, which parties do you expect the SPD to invite a new government coalition? I mean, I think that when you look at the numbers, the SPD wants what they call, like I said, the Germans love to think of their political parties in terms of colors, right? Black, red, green, yellow. And so the phrase that Olaf Scholz has used and that the SPD uses is a stoplight coalition. So red for the SPD, yellow for the FDP, green for the Greens. That's the government that Olaf Scholz wants. That's the government that right now, at this moment, has the best chances of happening. And because it would show a break with the past, so it would let everybody say that, you know, we're starting something new, and it would give the SPD the chance, because they did come in first. It allows the SPD to select the chancellor, but it will require, and that's where the Greens and the FDP right now are talking among themselves about what kind of price they will demand from each other and from the SPD in order to enter into that government. But that is the most likely one right now. The next most likely one is what we call the Jamaica coalition. And that's the colors of the flag of Jamaica. That's black, yellow, and green. So that would be the CDU, CSU with the FDP and the Greens. That exists on several state levels right now, a couple of state levels now. And back in 2017, Merkel had begun exploring the possibility of building just such a coalition after the 2017 election, but those negotiations had failed because Christian Lindner and the FDP decided they weren't ready to do that. And so 4 years later, Lindner wants to be finance minister, wants to be in a government. Will the FDP drop some of its objections? So it remains to be seen. But I say the stoplight is most likely, with Jamaica as a clear second. Beyond that, you know, if all those negotiations break down, right, the idea of another grand coalition is still out there, but I think that's the least likely possibility. Can a green foreign minister push more policies on climate change, crisis, and net zero emission? Yes. And I will say this is where, if you end up with any coalition that has both the Greens and the FDP, one of the sticking points is going to be how does a German government, because everybody talks about the environment now. Everybody talks about it. And certainly with the floods that were earlier in Germany, climate change is in everybody's mind. Everybody talks about environmental policy. But what does it mean when you actually have a Green Party in government now in Germany that can do something about it, or will push a particular vision about it? And, you know, so if the Greens decide to become, you know, as would happen in any sort of coalition, if you have a Green foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, 40 years old, who is the Green Party's chancellor candidate, if she becomes foreign minister and she becomes an advocate for net zero emissions, when she becomes for all sorts of things like that, how will she bump heads with a Chancellor Olaf Scholz, but also with a finance minister Christian Lindner from the FDP, who would have business organizations in his ear telling him that this is going to cost them a lot of money? And so I think that That's going to be a big part of the coalition negotiations. As I say, they're going to have to come up with a detailed agreement, and chances are that agreement will lay out a kind of common language, talking points for what they're going to do. But I see that as being the place where there will be tensions within, if we get that stoplight coalition, that's where the tensions are going to be. After Angela Merkel, how will the immigration policy be taken forward, and how do you see the relationship of Germany with China under the SPD? Yeah, I mean, obviously, among the things that are famous for Angela Merkel was her decision in 2015 to try to deal with the humanitarian crisis of migrants by, as Richard Haas says this in an article in Foreign Affairs Today, is she didn't necessarily open Germany's borders, as she basically accepted the reality that these migrants were flooding into Europe, and the Greeks didn't want to hold on to them, and nobody else was going to do anything about it, so Germany had to do something. Germany's policy since then, however, has been more aimed at limiting the flow of refugees, right? Because Merkel makes an agreement with the Turkish government to limit the flow of refugees, and to try to force some kind of broader European cooperation on the resettlement of refugees, which is something the Europeans are on paper saying they're in favor of. I see a future German government is trying to do those same things. I don't see the future German government is not going to suddenly is not going to emphasize open borders. That's not going to be the thing. But I do think that that there's going to be, especially now with the collapse of the government in Afghanistan, right, as Europe is going to face some difficult questions about how to deal with migrants, how to deal with refugees, how to deal with asylum seekers. And certainly the Greens and the SPD have many politicians who are themselves have been much more sympathetic to migrants. And that's going to be an interesting thing going forward, because Germany also faces significant demographic problems, low birth rate, where some kind of controlled migration is going to be necessary. And to figure out how they do that, that's going to be difficult. As far as what's the relationship with China going to be, so far, right, the German attitude towards China is, we would like to be able to occasionally tut over human rights violations, but please don't stop buying our cars. And eventually, right, the Germans are going to have to confront the tension between those two positions. I think that a Green foreign minister will be a lot more critical of China than the current foreign minister, who is Heiko Maas of the SPD. I think that Annalena Baerbock would be more critical of China than that. But what that means, since those kinds of relations between great powers like that are almost, they're more concentrated in the chancellery than they are in the foreign ministry, that Olaf Scholz, finance minister originally from Hamburg, very business, very trade oriented, I see him taking a very cautious line with the Chinese. I can't say that makes me very happy, but I think that's likely what's going to happen. So which personages should we be looking for, asks Bren Prubutok, right? You should think of Olaf Scholz, current German finance minister, who is likely to be chancellor. Annalena Baerbock, who is one of the leaders of the Greens, is very likely to be foreign minister. If not her, Robert Habeck, who is her co-chair of the party, will likely have a role in government too. For the Free Democrats, Christian Lindner, who is a young, dynamic politician type, very nakedly ambitious. He is likely not only to be finance minister, but also to be very much a big spokesman when it comes to issues of trade and international finance. Right, those are the names you're going to hear a lot as we hear these negotiations going forward. Within the CDU/CSU, Armin Laschet is, as of right now, is still chair of the CDU. Markus Söder, who is the chair of the CSU and is the governor of Bavaria. Söder has ambitions. He wanted to be the chancellor candidate of the whole bloc, but didn't make it this time. He is likely going to try to push his national profile forward to supplant Laschet. But Bavaria also has elections coming up in 2023. So his future will depend on how well the CSU does in the next state elections. But those are some names to think about. You could also think about some younger politicians out there whose names will be out there for the CDU. Jens Spahn, who's the current health minister. He's a more conservative, social conservative member of the party. He may be an up and coming leader. Friedrich Merz, MERZ, who is an economics and finance guy who had been more conservative from the party, has essentially been driven out of the party by Merkel, is making something of a comeback within the party. With the SPD, right, Heiko Maas, the current foreign minister, he will play a role going forward, and the leadership of the SPD. Now, I haven't talked about the alternative for Germany much, and I'm almost out of time. But I do think that it will be interesting to see, right, that the party's success is real, but it's also the alternative for Germany has plateaued. In fact, they lost a couple of percentage points nationally from 2017 to 2021, which raises questions about, where they're going to go from here, right? They clearly now, they have a very clear geographical base in southeastern Germany, but that base is that's not the fastest growing part of Germany. It's not the most dynamic part of Germany. And the idea of becoming just a sort of former GDR protest party is not a growth strategy for them. They have failed so far in their desire to reach deeper into the center of politics, to win over more CDU voters, right? They didn't win over a lot of new voters this time from the center. And so there is likely to be some real disagreements within the AfD about what their path going forward should be. Should they double down on their Euroscepticism and their right populist themes, or should they find a way to soften their message to appeal more to the center? They're going to be fighting about this for quite some time. Patalia Tate asked the question of Brexit. Yes, this is an interesting one too, and this is a good one to think about. Is that while all of the main political parties they're very strong advocates for the EU, and so they are all on record as saying they don't think Brexit was a good idea. There is a willingness to work with the British going forward when they think more globally, especially that Olaf Scholz being from Hamburg has a lot of connections to Great Britain, and so that's likely to play a role. I mean, we'll have to have a separate briefing to talk more about the future of Brexit. Right now, the British are struggling with some of the practical consequences, but also exploring the possibilities of global Britain, and so that's going to be for Germany. For the next German government, it's always this trilateral relationship between Germany, the UK, and France to figure out where does Europe fit, where do the Europeans fit. And now that the UK is outside of the European Union, right, there still is that relationship, and that's going to be a challenge for this new German government going forward. One last question from Oliver Stelling. I'm sorry. The two kingmakers, Greens and Liberals, together won more votes than the winner of the election, the SPD, which is true. They've also started their internal discussions already without involving the SPD. What's my take on that? My take on that is this is what's going to make this new situation for the Germans going forward so interesting as well. The SPD is bigger than either of its two coalition partners. It is not bigger than them put together. Means that this is likely to be more of a coalition of semi-equals than we have ever had before within Germany. That can be really good for democracy because it can mean that we'll have folks who are sort of arguing about policy and are able to put their ideas into practice while all generally agreeing on the need to make the Federal Republic work. So we're not talking about fragmenting into pieces where the people want to blow the whole thing up. So that can be good, but it's new and it's different. It's different for the Germans, and how well the Germans handle this. It's a real opportunity. This is the positive way to put this. It's a real opportunity for the Germans to see how their consensus-based political system can function when you can have strong political parties that may disagree in detail, but are all willing to make the system work. That can be a really good thing, but it's going to be new and different. And I think it's a really interesting thing that both the Greens and the FDP realize that they needed to meet with each other so quickly before they began any individual negotiations with either of the other two big parties. So they recognize they don't want to be played off against each other just yet, but they want to make sure they get the best deal they can get. And the next few weeks and months will be very interesting to watch these negotiations continue. Whew. That looks like that's all the questions. I'm sure there are more questions out there. I hope that you'll take a peek at my article, that you'll feel free to write to me if you have any further questions for anything else we can talk about. This has been delightful to have you all here. I want to thank all of you for tuning in for this. If you have enjoyed this kind of briefing and this kind of conversation, I hope you'll tell your friends about FPRI, and you will bring a friend to the next event that you go to, that you will consider becoming a member or partner of FPRI so that you can help to support this kind of work that we do. That if you want to know about our schedule, please check out our website, fpri.org. Follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this particular briefing on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. I hope to see you all again at future events. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.